This is the slide of thick skin or non-hairy skin. First question, how do we say that this is the slide of thick skin? The first thing let's try to do is compare the thickness of the epidermis. The epidermis is comparatively thick than the entire thickness of the epidermis in case of thin skin. And even in this, the thickness of the stratum corneum is almost greater than the thickness of rest of the other layers of the stratified squamous keratinized epithelium. Then the subsequent layers we can see the papillary dermis and reticular dermis with sweat glands. The hair follicles and sebaceous glands are conspicuously absent. This is how we tell that this is the slide of thick skin. The next question, describe the structure of thick skin. Again, thick skin is made up of two major layers excluding the hypodermis. So, thick skin contains an outer epidermis and an inner dermis. The epidermis is formed by stratified squamous keratinized epithelium, which is made up of 5 distinct layers. In order to identify these 5 layers, let's shift it to 40x magnification. First, again compare the thickness of the stratum corneum with that of the entire thickness of rest of the layers, right? This is one distinguishing feature you must remember. So let's identify the layers of the epidermis by shifting it to 40x magnification. So let's imagine we have the entire epidermis brought into focus now. Yes, right? So we are seeing it pretty clearly, the entire epidermis. So the basal layer, as we can see, is stratum basale. Above this we have the layer of stratum spinosum, or also called as prickle cell layer, and here now we can make out a clear stratum granulosum which contain the granulosa cells with keratohyalin granules, the topmost layer formed by squamous cells. Then in between that squamous cell layer and the stratum corneum, we can see a clear layer, and this clear layer represents a layer called as stratum lucidum. The stratum lucidum consists of dead cells without any cell organelles but which have retained cell boundaries. On top of this, we have the keratin layer which contains a acellular layer formed by the keratin protein. Within this stratum corneum, we can see the ducts of sweat glands. Now try and compare the thickness of stratum corneum and rest of the layers of the entire epidermis. So stratum corneum is very much thicker, almost up to the extent of 40 to 50 layers of keratin is present here, whereas in case of thin skin, it is limited to 5 to 15. Right? So this is how we describe the epidermis of thick skin. Then if we come further down, we can clearly see the papillary dermis extending into the epidermis as finger-like projections, and then if we come lower down, we have the reticular dermis which contains, let's say, blood vessels, but the most important feature we must identify here is the presence of the sweat glands. Let's think where exactly thick skin is present. Thick skin is present in or over the palm and the soles, right? So these areas, do they sweat or not? They sweat profusely, right? So the thick skin will have plenty of sweat glands, and these are again ecrine sweat glands. Remember again, apocrine sweat glands are found only in the region of the axilla or the pubis or the groin region, where they are responsible for body odor. So this is the sweat gland and its duct system. These ducts ultimately open into the stratum corneum, right? This is regarding the reticular dermis, and if we explore further deep down, we can identify the hypodermis, right? So all of this is the hypodermis region. Now this is how we should go on and describe the structure of the thick skin. What are the differences between thick skin and thin skin? If we just recollect, the entire epidermis is thinned out in thin skin or hairy skin. Hairy skin is found in all the area of the body except palm and soles. The epidermis in case of thin skin is made up of 4 layers, and these are stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum and stratum corneum. The thickness of the stratum corneum is much lower or much lesser than the entire thickness of the other 3 layers. In case of thick skin, we have 5 layers: stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum and stratum corneum. The thickness of the stratum corneum itself is more than the thickness of rest of the layers of epidermis. The structure of papillary dermis is almost the same in case of thin skin and thick skin. When we come to reticular dermis, in case of thin skin, we have hair follicles, erector pylorus muscle and sebaceous glands, which are characteristically absent in case of the thick skin. The only comparison with reticular dermis is the presence of sweat glands in both the types of skin. This is how we must identify the differences between the 2 types of skin. But if you want to identify this in practical, presence of hair follicle and sebaceous glands, thin skin, absence of hair follicle, thick skin, right? And then comes rest of the features. This is how you must identify, define and describe a slide of thick skin.